We are live, I hope.
Yes, we are recording.
I'm trying to see how many
Yes, we can see people.
numbers. Yeah, we'll just wait for people to sign in. People are coming in very rapidly at the moment. But let me start by saying welcome, everybody. We'll just hang on just to allow a few people to get in. We've literally just gone online. So welcome, everybody. I want to introduce our speakers in just a minute, but I'm going to wait until we've got at least hopefully the majority of people in. Okay. I think we're the numbers are leveling off a little bit now. That's good. No, they're still going. Okay. Let me say good afternoon to everybody. And let me start by saying this is going to be recorded this afternoon. So if you please just be careful in what you say. Please don't, if you're asking questions or making comments, please don't share any private information. Please keep it sort of moderate, if that's okay with you, please. I want to introduce our speakers this afternoon to this first FAB seminar, first of the FAB seminar series. So it's a real pleasure to actually open this, and thank you for inviting me to open it. I want to introduce our two speakers this afternoon. The first is Natasha Paul. She's a multidisciplinary, in the true sense of the word, if you look at her CV, a multidisciplinary academic, novelist, poet, and economist. And over the past 2 decades, she's researched and published extensively on themes relating to democracy, political economy, identity, the rise of right-wing nationalism, feminist and post-colonial critiques, Bhutan, India, and Kashmir. Areas that I'm very interested in, areas that I've had the pleasure of working in over many years. So I'm really looking forward to this afternoon. Her books include Imagining Economics Otherwise, Future Tense, Man Asia Literary Prize shortlisted Residue. She co-edited the Economic and Political Weekly volume on Women and Kashmir in December 2018, and Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak? And that was published in 2020. Currently, she's an associate professor in politics and international relations at the Centre for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster in London. Previously, she was an associate professor in creative writing in Bhutan and a tenured assistant professor in economics at the Bristol Business School. She holds a joint doctorate in economics and philosophy, which she obtained in 2003, and a master's in science in economics with a specialization in public policy from the University of Hull. And she writes extensively and speaks within and outside academia, which I think is always interesting. Our own Meena Dhanda, I think most people on this call will know, well known to most of us. She's our own professor of philosophy and cultural politics. Welcome, Meena, lovely to have you with us. Her research focus is on understanding injustices, prejudices, and misrepresentations suffered by powerless groups, which she pursues through transdisciplinary studies, specifically connecting caste, class, gender, and race. Really complicated subjects really being pulled together. Her work includes The Negotiation of Personal Identity in 2008, and Reservations for Women, also in 2008, besides numerous papers in international journals, book chapters, and reference works. She holds a doctorate from Oxford University, where she was a Commonwealth Scholar and a Rhodes Junior Research Fellow. Her recent publications are on Philosophical Foundations of Anti-Casteism, 2020, and The Power of Counter-Ritual, 2021, just published. So welcome, everybody. Lovely to have you all with us. If there are questions that are coming up, and thank you for putting it in the chat box, if there are questions you have, please put them into the chat box as we go, and we will revisit those at the end. So thank you all for being with us, and thank you. Over to you, Meena.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you so much. A very, very warm welcome, Nitasha, and to all the participants who are here to listen to us. This is really a conversation And the star of this conversation today is actually Nitasha. We will be focusing on her contributions to our understanding of Kashmir. My role is really to ask some reflective questions, and I find it fascinating that we have a link which I didn't know we had, which is that both of us have studied philosophy. So that's fantastic. I'm very pleased to have learned that in the last few years. Um, so, Nitasha, I'm going to first invite you to tell us about your understanding of Kashmir and the historical and political context of writing on Kashmir and Kashmiris, which is the backdrop to the novel which I will focus on, which is Future Tense, published by HarperCollins in 2020. So tell us and the audience who assume know nothing. I'm sure many of them know a lot, but assume they know nothing. And tell us in a few minutes what is the context of your writing.
Right. Thank you so much for hosting this, and thank you, Philip, for the introduction, and Meena for that very generous introduction as well. I completely agree with you. I think dialogical thinking and thinking with other people is perhaps the most interesting kind of thinking, as we find places in ourselves that we don't otherwise go to with that. So about Kashmir, I mean, this is probably the hardest bit of the conversation for me going to be, because I have to, put in years and years of history, decades, centuries of history into a very short period of time. But let's assume you haven't heard of Kashmir at all, for the person here who hasn't. Well, you would have still heard about it, because perhaps you would have heard about it in the sense of the Kashmir shawl, in the sense of the Led Zeppelin song. So what I want to say really is that Kashmir is an overdetermined place. It's a place usually that through very specific filters and prisms. So people would either know it through a very Orientalist, exotic, othered place, the place of shawls and mountains and the Switzerland of India, or that kind of structure within which it gets seen, or the other way in which you would know that is through through a place of terrorism and violence and conflict, and a place that's forever kind of haunted by something very, very divided and divisive. So these two polarizations are the ways. I call them Kashmir the cruel and Kashmir the beautiful. Like, those are the only two tropes through which it's often understood. Now, what that is that it's a region with a very complex patchwork of identities, languages, histories that has been bracketed in the 20th century into. Meena, for some reason your screen's frozen. Am I being heard? Is this working? Hello? Hello? Is this? Sorry, I
Yeah,
think
we can hear you.
Oh,
We can
okay,
hear you.
great. Because yeah, it's not like a room. So unlike a room, I can't see people. So I don't know if everything's just gone wrong. Okay, thank you for letting me know. Right. So what it is that in the last, over centuries and millennia, it has been ruled, as it were, by different kinds of dynasties. And in the modern era, in the 19th century onwards, it has been sold. That region as a whole has been, bargained over. It has been bought and sold through treaties. And in the early part of the 19th century, there was one very well-known treaty called the Treaty of Amritsar. So the inhabitants of Kashmir have always received less attention in the official histories than the region, than the place as land, and as a land that happens to be at the intersection of many historical empires. In the 20th century, what happens is that at the time that India and Pakistan become independent post-colonial nations, Kashmir is not on the midnight of 14th and 15th August. It doesn't belong to either, as it were. And then there's this prolonged, protracted conflict because of the way in which the line of control gets created. So Kashmir is sought to be possessed by both of these entities. There's also a ruler who's in Kashmir, in that region, who is who's unrepresentative and not really very well liked. So then we have, decades of elite bargains and post-colonial securitizations and various kinds of other center-periphery machinations in the Kashmir context that then bring us to the 80s. And in the 80s, we have so there's, and all along this whole process, up until the last years of the 20th century, you don't actually have the Kashmiris themselves, very much as in the present, aren't the ones who are deciding their fate. Then towards the late 80s and throughout the 90s, you have a further fracture. It's not just between India and Pakistan, or India, Pakistan, and China. You also have a further fracture within Kashmir of Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims. There's the Kashmiri Pandit exodus. Kashmiri Pandits are Kashmiri Hindu minority of the region of the Kashmir Valley. And then through the 90s, there's this, there's this continued saga of human rights violations, emergency-led powers to the armed forces, and so on. You have some various kinds of overtures that happen in the name of peace processes throughout the start, throughout that period, but also towards the start of the 21st century. And then specifically from 2008, 2010, 2014, 2016, 2017, up until 2019, you have periodic uprisings that are sort of a new generation of Kashmiris that has grown up within the region, especially in the Kashmir Valley, with that history, and that their uprisings every few years just successively happen. It's a cycle that keeps repeating itself. And all of this is, of course, marked by a tremendous casualty of human life, and of various kinds of deprivations of rights, liberties, of all of this. And then we come fast forward to 2019, when the autonomy and the statehood of Kashmir, whatever limited amount it had, also gets taken away. So Kashmir essentially is about, if we're talking about the dispute part of Kashmir, it's essentially a political dispute which is marked by an overwhelming focus on territoriality at the cost of any consideration for either popular sovereignty or people's lives and the way in which they experience power, and the right to self-determination, which is that long-standing contentious thing that was promised in theory, the plebiscite, that then never happened, and as well the continued human rights violations, which have been documented by not just entities within there, but also OHCHR and other kind of more global entities. So this just continues. That's the history of the place, and how it has been. How the divides there have been fostered, trust has been broken. There are all of these different stories. There are various tales of collaborations. So personally, for me, 2010 is when I wrote an article, and all of these things, by the way, are available online, called Kashmir, A Place of Blood and Memory, in which I looked at, it's a long piece of work in which I look at the ways in which I talk about how there is what I call a Mandarin-Machiavelli interaction between the elites at the center and at the periphery, and that does not take into account the interests of the people, and it's not really representative. It's just a kind of a reworking of the old colonial tactics of in a way controlling the hills from the plains, as it were. So I talk about that complexity of Kashmir and the way in which Kashmiri identity becomes a casualty in that. Then over successive years, I wrote about the youth of Kashmir. There's an article called The Idea of India and Kashmir. Then I worked on, after that, subsequently also worked on something called Loving and Losing Kashmir, again about, what does this kind of desire do? So to me, in 2016, in the aftermath of the summer of the uprising following Burhan Wani and a militant's killing and the pellet blindings, I wrote something called from funerals to freedom, where I refer to to the ways in which this endless cycle of funerals and demonstrations continues, where there's a public funeral, which then becomes a demonstration, which is then fired upon, which then becomes another funeral, and that cycle continues. But also on what does this kind of crazy focus on territoriality do? So thinking about it in terms of something like cruel optimism, Lauren Berland's cruel optimism, when just the desiring of Kashmir in that kind of possessive proprietorial way that the two nation states of India and Pakistan have done, which is also, by the way, very gendered, that obsession is actually detrimental to the well-being of the populations within those states too. But yes, of course, it does serve a certain kind of oppositional but equivalent interests of whether they be bureaucratic or the interests of the armed forces and so on. So there's there's that. And then in 2018, there's something that I published in the Feminist Review called Indian Obsession with Kashmir, Democracy, Gender, and Anti-Nationalism, where I talk about the 3 ways in which this is gendered. So basically, in cartographic sense, where India is projected and cartographically, and Kashmir is seen as the head of Mother India, and this kind of space where you just cannot negotiate, and these people have to be just subdued. And very violent rhetoric around that on extremist, especially Hindutva extremist forums about, that not compromising on land, even if it means killing all people, that kind of rhetoric, very genocidal rhetoric. All of this, which is also then carried out in the name of the Kashmiri Pandits who are, and I've written about this, used as pawns in the Hindutva project very often. So there's the cartographic, there's also the possessive idea, the idea that, people describe this thing of India and Kashmir as if it were a marital union, or as if Kashmir is a petulant mistress that needs to be subdued, or a wife that needs to be beaten. And this is kind of also a part of something that is out there. So it's kind of, it's a very gendered way of looking at it. Even when the autonomy and statehood were revoked, people spoke about, marrying fair-skinned Kashmiri women and so on. So there's those ways in which it's analyzed it through a feminist perspective. The Economic and Political weekly issue and the book that was published called Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak, which I've co-edited, it's been like a great pleasure and privilege to bring together this work for the first time ever, which has been done by Kashmiri women on Kashmiri women, and about their lives. And and especially with the book, we have a young Kashmiri female photojournalist whose images are used in the cover. So both as a person, as an individual, but also collaboratively, it's life's work. It's one part of my existence that that just continues to.
Thank you, Natasha. That was quite a feat to say in a few words the long history of the ups and downs of this.
Everything from here would be easy. That was the hardest.
Yeah. So I'm sure there will be questions too. So shall we talk a little bit about your novel, Future Tense? So in the novel itself, actually, you also talk about how there is the everydayness of violence, of people in the same conversation talking about the weather and encounter killings. And then you also, your main character, Shireen, who is doing an MA in philosophy in JNU, I really connected with her a lot. And she has decided to do a PhD on her stories. And then there are examples of, she recounts examples of mass rape by the army as well as by potentially militants, and both sides, so to speak. And as you just mentioned, that your recent work on Kashmiri women is an attempt to bring all that together. You mentioned in your novel certain slogans, and there was one which I wondered if there were others which could be juxtaposed to it. So Kashmir Banega Pakistan. Could you tell us a little bit about the non-sectarian voices who are speaking for Kashmir, but neither for this side or that side, who are really for Kashmiris? Just briefly.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think that the thing about that kind of experienced violence, and this book, Future Tense, really, I mean, the kind of one-line summary of it would be to say it's about what happens to big dreams on small canvases that become even smaller by the politics of conflict. So it's about the suffocations, the various kinds of suffocations experienced by people who have inherited those histories, or who live in places that are like Kashmir. So there's a banalization of violence, and also its multifaceted everyday nature, in that there aren't any safe spaces, and also and this takes various kinds of convolutions happen within it. So drawing attention to violence in certain spaces, such as the household, also becomes a fraught act in a conflict zone. So there are now part of why writing fiction, or this novel, or my previous novel Residue, which was also about Kashmiris but outside of Kashmir, and it was set in Berlin, also again a place with a history of division, is to center the narratives that aren't so often in the media. So, it isn't just about the killings. It is about the killings, of course, and the media will tell you different kinds of stories about it, but it's also about the lived spaces in the classrooms, in the kitchens, in the, in the cafes, where life is where there are spaces where life still in its particular kind of, frothy existential way continues. And that's, so that kind of, focus on narrative, on the differences of narrative is important, because I think it's important to have that autonomy and to not write just about a specific kind of people, and that's very easy. So when you mentioned the Kashmir Banega Pakistan thing, so it's very easy in a way to see Kashmir only through the prism of either India or Pakistan. And the hardest kind of space and the hardest way for people to exist politically in that space, or talking about that space, is if you're actually not tying into these nation statist agendas of these two countries, and if you're saying, well, this is about the prioritization of Kashmiri lives, and that's really hard, because and very often those are the people that get targeted by any and every side, because each side would accuse you of somehow not doing the right thing. And the Hum Kya Chahte Azaadi slogan, which also kind of features in the book, that's one of those slogans that quite straightforwardly says, what do we want? Freedom. However, there isn't, so religion, it isn't possible anymore, I think, to deny, if it ever was, which is also, again, another kind of complex matter, but it isn't possible to deny the fact that religion is very much now a part and kind of deeply intertwined into this conflict, because that is the way in which that issue has been weaponized for political profit within India and within Pakistan, but also people's sense of and the fact that people in Kashmir Valley, the ones who are there now, are Kashmiri Muslims, and the fact that the people who are outside are Kashmiri Hindus also adds to this divide. So there are kind of multiple levels of division, and a novel is a because not everybody perhaps reads footnotes, a novel is also a way of telling those stories, the multiplicity of tragedies that affect
But
people.
in your novel, I remember you've also at one point made the point that when there's a group of people who's in Goa, that it's not only Kashmiri Muslims, Kashmiri Pandits who have had to leave Kashmir. There are Kashmiri Muslims also who have had to leave Kashmir. It isn't just a clean religious divide, so to speak. And I want to also think about in the novel what you are able to do really rather well is the craft these really intense and complex interpersonal relationships which cross that religious divide. So the key relationship you have is this really wonderful, warm, and unsullied friendship between a Kashmiri Pandit girl, Shireen Raina, and Sayama, a Muslim from Kargil, and they seem to be unbreakable. They indeed are. I mean, the whole of the novel, and they are sharing lodgings, and I thought that was quite a very strong part of your novel, and this is happening in an atmosphere of mistrust. You also describe that how difficult it is. Like Rehan, the journalist, he says there's mistrust everywhere, and the media is so treacherous, and it doesn't matter which side you take, you're always going to be criticized by some other side. So it's impossible to demarcate that space which is non-sectarian. In non-sectarian, I don't mean necessarily non-religious, but non-sectarian in the sense which is honest, objective, not trying to give thing details as they are. And that's a very difficult space. And I think you express that really rather well. And I did think I wonder whether a friendship like that is really possible. I mean, it's your construction in the novel, but is it really possible given that there are these competing histories in a very, very fractured polity? In one love relationship you show in the novel between Fayaz and Shireen, that breaks down at one point when Fayaz is just made a random comment that you can't be a Kashmiri if you're walking barefoot like this on the grass, and Shireen gets so angry, and she gets angry. She's a Kashmiri Pandit girl, and she's saying, I'll cite from what you say there. Fayaz, if two people, if you and I, who care for each other, cannot get past these things, these histories of ours, then what hope is there for anyone, for anything, for Kashmir? So Can people really get past these differences?
Um, my name means ever renewing hope, and I have to often remind myself of that. I think we do live in a, in a world that's marked by a simultaneity of hope and hopelessness, and despair, and especially with something like this. I mean, hope is an active thing. It's something that you have to do, because if not, what then? So and part of these telling these stories and thinking in this kind of affective way alongside the analytical way when talking about thinking about Kashmir, is that a lot of this is real. So there's an episode in the book. I mean, of course, Bichor is a fictional character. There's a fictional character, but that episode of the Human Shield was actually real. Likewise, the episode of the boatman who kind of dives into the river to save the Indian tourists, that's actually a real thing. So many of these things were real. And as far as friendships are concerned, one, I think both in this and my previous work, also in Residue, friendships are a core kind of human relationality that I think is important for me to explore, because I feel that that's one place in which that bridging, as it were, I'm going to just, since you're a philosopher and the others may excuse us, I'm just going to throw in a few references. But that kind of interlinking of horizons, that Gadamerian thing, how does that happen? There's something very alchemical about how and when that happens, but it can happen. People can overcome those things, but not in a naive way. So it's that Aaron thing. It's not like if you are being targeted for who you are, it's very kind of silly to expect a person to say, well, no, I'm just a neutral abstract human being because you're being targeted because you're Jewish or Muslim or Pandit or whatever. So within that context, something has to happen, which happens but rarely, where there can be that intersubjective linking. And I think in those instances where that friendship really survives, or whether it's these the mistrusts and the historic divides, that is of interest to me. In the previous book, it was Leon and Kea. In this one, it was Saima and Shireen. Their friendship is important to me. Now, whether that is something that could really happen, I think it could, and partly because they are not there. It's also, so for me personally, meeting people who are also Kashmiri, but a different kind of Kashmiri because they're from the other side of the line of control, is something that happens on the other side of the world in London, in England, rather than in the South Asian subcontinent, as it were. So it's when you are not within that space and you meet people who kind of relate to that area in a different way, it's more possible to have those communications happen. So that's something that I think that could happen in a place like JNU, but it would be much harder for that to happen, in an environment that's very vitiated by those kinds of divides where everything has other meanings attached to it. That's how I would explain that friendship. And the thing about how whether friendships can overcome that, the triggers can be seemingly very superficial, as in this case, the statement that Fayaz makes, not necessarily with any ill intent, but for Shireen, it kind of goes to the very core of her sense of herself as Kashmiri, but not quite Kashmiri in the same way because of her specific kind of pain. And so in that sense, the very fact that those triggers can be so superficial and yet so intense indicates the extent to which a discourse of competing victimhoods works in Kashmir. So it's like my pain but a different kind of pain, and your pain, and somebody's lost a home, and somebody's lost, has memories of exile, another person has talks about extrajudicial killings, or just having witnessed all kinds of violations or corruption or rape. So it's the differences and the different kinds of pain that get mapped in systematic ways onto separate communities, and that inhibits the space for there being that intersubjective understanding. And in a story, you can kind of do that more than you can in other forms of telling, because stories are also about a thinking otherwise. For me, literature is also a thinking of the counterfactual, of that which imagination may make possible, even if it isn't possible at the moment.
There are many of these longings which are connected to having been displaced. So you have Imran, who is living in the city but really wants to have the sense of belonging that his village friends have. Just that displacement is disturbing for him. And Shireen for whom I found this really moving. She even says Kashmir was a longing for her, an unaddressed belonging that she had managed to contain by keeping away from it. And this is when they've just landed in Leh, and there's this beauty of the landscape and everything that she has stayed away from. And to retain that longing and that connection with the place by actually not going there. But of course, later she goes back there as a researcher towards the end, when she's going to research all this violence against women as a part of her PhD. So all of these descriptions about the a place being created more by the desire for the place rather than by the territory. So because in that territorial sense, you're saying, you're taking the example of the grandmother of Shireen, who actually doesn't care about different places, and she's considered a little bit insane. And you comment that a mad person has no country. It takes a collectivity of mad people to create a country to die for. So I thought that these very dialectical emotions, on the one hand, you have a strong attachment to a place, a beautiful place, which you dream about, and a place which you want to be remain connected to. On the other hand, you don't want these wars about the territory to just carry on. There's something has been missed in these wars, territorial wars that are taking place, which is the deep attachment that people have to the place. And I thought that that was really quite fascinating. I do want to point out one kind of emotional dissonance, which is when you talk about after the death of Burhan Wani, and Shireen comments that she's not beating her chest in desperate anguish. There was no way she would emotionally hear the news of the killing. So just as you explained a minute ago, so do the events that take place, people are moved in different ways. So they may all be connected by their desire for Kashmir, but their political response, if you like, partly depending upon their location, are they bereft with grief, or are they just angry that there's an extrajudicial killing happened, and it's tragic that this man has been killed. These are different responses, and I'm reminded of the different responses that happened when Operation Blue Star happened in 1984 in Punjab. The responses of people who were otherwise maybe on the same side weren't the same. Some people were bereft with grief. There were others who were just angry that the army had moved in and that was just wrong. And there were others who actually thought it was the right thing. There was also that element. So this somehow, this deeper connection of the political position one is able to take, and how much and how one is able to feel, does seem to be connected to one's location and one's birth status, or whatever one has inherited. So I wonder what you would say about it.
Yes, I think that the way, as you were just mentioning, I think that the upheavals, the kind of there is a way in which there are various kinds of upheavals that modern history, that anyone, all of us, whoever, even if we are not Kashmiri, we have these various kinds of upheavals as processes that, let's use a placeholder term like globalization or something like that for it, that we've all been affected by these moves of labor and capital. But in addition to that, in what happens in a conflict place, and that to a place of conflict in a post-colonial setting, and that's also important because there are various kinds of colonial histories that not only get inherited but also then get perversely used. So whereas India was once or British India, and India was once colonized by Britain, that same kind of colonial move in its own peripheries by post-colonial nations does not get seen as colonial. So there's that way in which that colonial history gets used. And then on top of that, there's this, especially ever more in the last 30 years, especially in the Indian case from the early 90s onwards, this idea of nation, of this, the Hindutva kind of BJP sort of project of the nation, which shares a lot of parallels with the nationalist Indian idea as well when it comes to Kashmir, but that then also takes it to a whole new level. Within that context, what does it mean to actually belong? Who can really belong to, today in 2021, who can really say, I am an authentic Indian and I'm the real one? Will the real Indian please stand up? And that's a very specific kind of person who does not fear the, kind of being the target of violence or intimidation or inauthenticity when they say they are Indian. And within the Kashmir context, that takes on an additional dimension because of the ways in which the histories and the memories of specific groups of Kashmiris, say Kashmiri Muslims and Kashmiri Hindus, if we're talking about the valley, there's other complexities around Ladakh and Jammu, but Kashmiri Hindus and Kashmiri Muslims, their histories, the salient points in those histories that they remember, the things that give them joy or grief, even down to the festivals that they celebrate, have been systematically rent asunder by kind of almost like a useful process that has deliberately done that, divided those people in order for them to function along those specific grooves and not to recognize their common pain as Kashmiris, but to see, to play pain off for their, for those, for people, specific people, to say, well, our pain is bigger than yours. And through that to construct a politics of pain that, that is very, very, in the South Asian context, we'd use the word communal. Here we'd say sectarian, because communal doesn't carry over the same sorts of meanings. But so that's so, and that is a function of location, not just geographical location, but a location in terms of one's religion, and and intersectionally, of course, and one's class, even caste, even caste within that context too. So all of those things determine what a person feels as their pain. And Burhan Wani, and this is again something very factual, that his name was his killing is a shibboleth. It gives a completely different response. You would have a completely different responses from people who would have mourned for him deeply, who spontaneously came out in that outpouring of grief and violence, at the fact that he was dead, because he was a young man, and the average age, as we are told, of a militant in Kashmir is 7 years, and this person was, on social media. So he was also representing a certain kind of, and of course this is also important to note, a certain kind of masculinity, which is, a performance of a certain kind of resistance masculinity, and his death provoked all sorts of responses. I mean, people saw his face in the moon and they cried, and that's also real as those who said, well, it's great that happened because this person was a militant, and he belonged to a militant outfit, which is also true. So those the systematic divisions in what is remembered, what is seen as painful, what is seen as worthy, although part of the same identity, as you just described in that example, is at the core of this tragedy.
And one really moving observation you have made in the novel is about children's games, which I think I'll never forget. Really, it's just, as you said, that our children, they remember that our children, they play games where they buried pebbles and make graves for them. I mean, in a context, that means people are not getting due burial, and children are playing games of burying pebbles. And I was just reminded, because this was 2 days ago, an article written by Satvinder Jus, which is on Bhagat Singh, that Bhagat Singh, who was hanged by the British 23rd March 1931. I didn't know this, that he was actually dismembered and then carried in gunny sacks out to Kasur, and he was given a very hurried cremation, and his charred remains were thrown in the river. And it was then villagers of that place who took out his charred remains and gave him a proper cremation. So it seems like 100 years have gone, and those methods of denigrating the dead, which we have inherited. Regimes change, but those methods don't change. They have continued. It's just so painful. And I was reminded also that I have heard your expert testimony on Kashmir, which you gave at the US congressional hearing on the 22nd of October 2019. If you will tell us a little bit about what's happened afterwards, and then I just want to ask you one final question about the novel. So.
The thing with bodies is that the kind of power that, in a very totalitarian sense, seeks to monopolize and control a collectivity and completely dominate land, also wants to erase the very kind of corporeality of bodies unless they are absolutely subject. And in the Kashmir context, this is again a long history of, you know, of the physical, because a body that can be buried, and within that context, I mean, of course, there are also the Kashmiri Pandits who don't bury the bodies, and they have a different kind of memory. But in the valley context, the burial, the graves, I mean, there's a graveyard in Srinagar called the Martyrs Graveyard. So, you know, those graves are places where people can go and remember. So the rememorialization and the continuation of history through memory is sought to be disrupted by acts that kind of, you know, do various kinds of desecrations to the body, not giving it, not returning it. In the Kashmir case, the famous instances of Afzal Guru, whose body was buried in prison in Delhi. Afzal Guru was accused of his role in the attack on the Indian Parliament in 2001. He was the only one of all of the accused who was hanged. He was hanged on the basis of circumstantial evidence, and the judge noted in his obiter dicta that that hanging was essential to satisfy the collective conscience of the nation. So that's sort of like the factual story here. Now, Afzal Guru's body, like the body of another Kashmiri nationalist earlier in the 80s, was buried in Tihar jail, in the prison in Delhi, without his family being informed. And the very idea of, and I think in the seminar article on the idea of India and Kashmir, I write about it, this idea of burying the body in the prison is a mise en abîme for the way in which, you know, the body of Kashmir is held in prison. So to not have people access even the body of the person who's dead. And of course, subsequently in 2016 in JNU, one of the ways in which the attack on student leaders was legitimized, progressive students, was legitimized by the state, was to say that these are, that these people were talking about Afzal Guru, and they were talking about freedom, and that's seditious. So these kinds of things kind of keep playing on. And regarding the testimony, I mean, that was, of course, a supremely kind of strange, a bizarre time. And were it not for Corona afterwards, I think nobody would have, I mean, the whole world would have known a lot more. So on the 5th of August, when the autonomy and statehood was revoked, Kashmir was put under a lockdown, which also meant cutting off of all lines of communication, like phones, internet, all of that. It was the longest ever ban on internet services in any democracy ever. So so that congressional hearing, and the written text of it is online, and the video is on YouTube as well. That testimony and its aftermath. So in November, there was a resolution that was moved in the House that, that drew upon elements of what I had talked about, because in that I talked about not just the context then and there, especially in the written testimony, but also about the answers to the questions, like what about Kashmiri Pandits, the way in which that gets used, or the short, medium, and long-term ways in which we might start to think about doing something for this. Sadly, when people try and resolve, they only think about speaking over the heads of Kashmiris, like they think about Indians and Pakistanis speaking to each other rather than Kashmiri voices themselves. But then in 2020, of course, since then, there's been this kind of global collective trauma of coronavirus, sadly. So for Kashmir, for people in that context, it was lockdowns within lockdowns, kind of a very fractal sense of what a lockdown was and how they experienced it.
Okay, I think I will reserve, I had a couple of more comments, questions, but I will pause for a minute because we've got 15 minutes to go, and there are people, there are questions in the Q&A, some in the chat box. So I think, to be fair to people who have very patiently listened and would be very keen to ask you questions, I will take some of them. And if I have space, then I'll come back to a couple of questions that I had about the language, the use of language in the novel. So here's a question in Q&A. This is Tosif Mir. How do you see future of Kashmiri resistance in relation to the right-wing rule in India? This is a researcher based in India who's asked you that question.
How do I see the future of the resistance? I think it is in the nature of resistance that, it continually finds ways of adapting and expressing itself, as with any other struggle. So it's not as if so what we have seen basically over the last 2 years is much greater censorship, surveillance, and restrictions on people's ability to express dissent because that also was the whole point of shutting things down, was for, for people, for their consent to not have been asked and for their dissent to not allowed to be expressed when this happened. Now, what resistance may be possible under ever growing restrictions on the ability to speak freely? uh, Perhaps not the, perhaps not the only in the ways in which people were resisting. And I think that critical consciousness is a key part of this story. I think a key part of this story is also to get people to understand why this is problematic, why it is not in anyone's interests for these violations to continue, or for this kind of rule to be legitimized in a region with that kind of history. So I think that part of thinking together, of speaking to people, of the public sphere, of writings, of art, of cinema, all of that, and Kashmiri voices are doing that, of music, all of that is perhaps a way in which one can bypass what is a very strong and powerful project and growing project of Hindutva in India. And part of that is also perhaps to think of thoughtful solidarities with other kinds of struggles in order to emphasize the ways in which nationalism does not have to be this, and perhaps even to go to the idea of, well, what does this do for India, and that this isn't just about Pakistan. I mean, one can get accused and of, well, people would say you're that saying that India it has done all of this means that Pakistan's right in everything. Of course not. I mean, there are both of these states are guilty of very severe human rights violations in different kinds in different regions, and when faced with the challenges in those regions. So it's not about kind of saying either one of these two states. Nobody has a clean kind of moral conscience here. But what we have to do is to draw attention to how any kind of lasting humanitarian and kind of more livable situation for the people who live there, and also for the people who belong there or who want to live there, cannot be achieved by doing these kinds of, by taking away people's rights, by forcibly settling outsiders there, by exploitation of resources. All of this is not, it's very important to have accountability. So to repeal emergency legislation, to let people have a say, the same sorts of things that one would think about when we think about people's rights, liberties, democracy, things like that. So what the future is right now, I think that the nature of resistance is, and I've said this actually also in Srinagar, and it needs some explaining, and it can be very easily misunderstood, but it's really important to understand what violence may achieve and when it may not achieve its intended objectives. And in a situation like this, I think that the idea of just there being this kind of, endless sacrifice of Kashmiri, specifically men, to a kind of resistance when you have this disproportionate, overwhelming state response to it, one has to really think about whether that is that what is going to get people to think about Kashmir. Because really, there are a whole lot of other places in the world where where bombs fall and still nothing. So it's not, violence has its I go back to that Aaron point here. I mean, violence is not the use of violence it's very it requires instruments. It doesn't require consent, and it can so easily go so very wrong, as we've seen including in the late 20th century history of Kashmir, and it makes other kinds of things more legitimate. So I think that for me personally, it is important to build words, to build understanding and critical consciousness, rather than to have this endless cycle of the kind of shutdowns, killings, militancy, state repression, which just never ends. So for me, when I think about resistance, that's what I think about.
Oh,
How to undo that.
spoken like a true philosopher there, I think. The power of critical thinking, changing minds, making people see the bigger picture and beyond immediate gains to what they think might be their very limited objectives, to think beyond that. So somebody has asked this question: how can we keep the idea of Kashmir as a place with all its beauty and conflict alive within and outside the state of Jammu and Kashmir? So this is about the idea of Kashmir. How can we keep that alive?
How can we keep it alive? I think I would say it depends on who the we is, because right now there are many attempts to keep a certain idea of Kashmir alive. And that has often meant, emphasizing specific accounts of Kashmir. And as I said, for me, the challenge is that the story that I want to tell isn't very neatly about either of these nation states. Whereas those ideas that this is Kashmir, Kashmir with India is great. It's everyone's, there's development, there's progress, there's employment, etc. That kind of narrative, or the tourism narrative, or the fact that that only this side is the problem, and that Pakistan side has, Kashmir has all of the liberties and no problems. All of those narratives, I feel like, have significant demonstrable problems. And I think part of being honest is to recognize that. And that does not necessarily mean you're creating various kinds of equivalences, which is what people get, might get kind of accused of. But understanding that it isn't about, what's really important is to think about, how do we decolonize this situation? How do we decolonize these lives? And how do we decolonize the very idea within India and Pakistan of their proprietorial attitude to solving Kashmir for the Kashmiris? And so therefore, to keep the idea of Kashmir alive, I think is a multi-dimensional process. There will be people who will as they do other things, as they have other achievements, will their identity as Kashmiri is important to them. And so likewise here in the UK, in the census this time, there was this idea, get yourself recognized as Kashmiri for people on either side. So there will be various kinds of uses that would be made by people of the idea of Kashmir, ranging from tourism to state, state representing itself as the developmental entity, and to people within there who might see the gains, private gains from collaboration. But I think the question really isn't so much about how do we keep the idea of Kashmir alive. I think it's how do we continue to be just and polyvocal? How do we keep hearing the different voices on Kashmir and not put it as our pain against their pain, or as set against impossible standards of purism in which everyone else is somehow corrupt and only you are the true torchbearer of what the right thing to do is. And I think all of that is that fraught process, and literature is very much a space within which that multiplicity can be kept alive.
Okay, we actually are, there is another question which in a bit I will ask, but before that, how do we, this is Ayushi Kaul, how do we understand the fracture between communities, especially that of KPs? I mean, I suppose that means Kashmiri Pandits in short form, that started in the 80s.
Yes, and some people drawing attention to the longer history of that as well, including in the period of the Dogra rule. I mean, for me personally, and I'll just come back to this question, for me personally, one of the sad bits is the way in which the progressive histories of Kashmir, which were not about communal forces, get completely forgotten in this whole story. So, all of these Europeans and people from progressives from different parts of the world actually coming to Kashmir, America in the early years of the Cold War, thinking that, Kashmir is like this new place to be worried about because a whole lot of these progressives and communists are gathering there. So all of those progressive histories get completely forgotten within this very fractured and kind of communalized idea of Kashmir. And so to the question of Kashmiri Pandits, I mean, I would, of course, draw attention to the section in the congressional testimony, which is called, in my report, which is called What About Kashmiri Pandits? Because that is the question so that you get faced with. So if I say, worry about human rights in Kashmir and how this is not right, and how the Hindutva project is weaponizing the pain of the minority community here, people would say, what about Kashmiri Pandits? And they would legitimize all kinds of Islamophobic violence within India in the name of revenge for what was done to the minority of Kashmiri Pandits. So I would draw your attention to that, and also to things that I've written over time, such as an article called The Weaponization of Kashmiri Pandits as a Pawn in the Games of Hindutva. which was published in The Wire in 2016, and something called The Communalization of a Political Dispute, which was published by Al Jazeera in 2017. All of the links are on my site. So where I talk about how do we how can we overcome these, and what are the sorts of truths and reconciliations that it requires to actually be able to witness this in a way that different pains are recognized, that there's this pain and then there's this other pain, and actually neither of them are unreal, and both of them have been created within the matrix of state interests that benefited from them. So and I think one very easy way in which moving forward on this is possible is to keep asking for inquiries into massacres.
Thank you.
It's a very straightforward thing that everyone can agree on. And if there is so much interest in weaponizing Kashmiri Pandit exodus for Islamophobic benefits that the Hindutva Project does, why won't they appoint inquiries that will conduct, and because they would have to do that for all of the people. So inquire into the Muslim massacres, the Sikh massacre, the Kashmiri Pandit massacres, and that's the way forward, because that's information, and that's also that's where you can bring law into this process, and it's really hard, and and so instead you have strange statements like, oh well, that was 27 years ago and the court says we can't really open up that inquiry. That's, and I think looking at the historic cases from South Africa to North Ireland to everywhere, Northern Ireland to everywhere else, I think those are the ways in which we have to continue pushing at this wall and say, well, yes, let's worry about the pain, let's worry about everyone's pain, and let's do these things about it. Let's create mechanisms for for accountability. Let's keep telling these stories so that it matters.
I want to bring back, there is one question about the role of literature, but I think I want to bring back from your novel a very powerful image. You have, the novel is bookended at the beginning and end by a very attentive observer who's deaf-mute, a deaf-mute orphan, and who's brought up by a gravedigger's family. And you try to signal the problems created by language itself. And you want to idealize communication by other means, as in that you write that a world in which eyes, skin, hands, deeds made sense of everything would be a sublime world. So it's like really drawing attention of people to respond to the humanity, to the human being in front of you, rather than be lost in ideological wars, which just use words in order to forward one agenda or another. So this I find really quite a powerful message as well. But then to reflect back on your own novel, you have a character in the novel saying, when did a story ever change a life? So you are doing this exquisite balance of telling stories on the one hand, and at the same time engaging in making a political engagement, all the way to the US congressional hearing, which we just heard of, an enormous number of writings in which you, as you just said, also you're asking for inquiries. So both of these things, on the one hand, expanding our human consciousness to respond to real human beings and the different kinds of suffering that people located in different places have because of the same situation, right? On one hand, and on the other hand, asking for something more legalistic, the rule of law, the use of law. I think that balance is really the key, isn't it? That you can't just do with one or the other. You do need to have both of those things working simultaneously. So Karthik's question was, what role can literature play in raising critical consciousness in supposedly postmodern times? Can it reinvent the grand narrative of humanism, solidarity, etc.? We've got like 30 seconds for you to answer that question.
So, Galliano's point about holding on to the right to dream, I think it's really important. And we must always be able to imagine beyond the possible. And actually, this is from the Imagining Economics book. I think that the contradictions that we have to live with are a fundamental fact, and there's no use denying them or pretending they don't exist. We have to live simultaneously, even though we fail every day. We have to continue trying to live as if as if we live forever and as if we'll die tonight, in the sense of what we want to do and what we want to focus on, and the sorts of meanings that matter today and that will matter 100 years hence. Within that context, I think so recognizing the fact that words can do something, that words matter, there is a possibility, they have a double might, they are powerful and they have a possibility, but also the fact that there are things that words may not do, that words may never do, and that realm, that experiential corporeal realm of sensing, the kind of Levinasian thing, face of the other, the immediacy, the bruteness of seeing pain or suffering or that kind of what reaction that is something that language will never adequately be able to encompass. That there is something kind of almost mystical in the idea of existence. Because you're a philosopher, I'll kind of just say Simone Weil here, and you'll kind of think that. So but the idea of how language is something, but then there is also a role of silences which are doing something, silences that are active. Like when Shireen can't actually speak about being Kashmiri in the same way, she understands their pain, but she has a different political history, and she's a Kashmiri Pandit, and she's got a different kind of silence that makes it hard for her to speak. But also so this child who cannot speak, and at the start of the book is when the bureaucrats, the Fayaz's former wife meets this child. So both of them have a different kind of pain, this woman and this child. That's how it begins, and by the end of the book, that's also the two of them. It's also to draw attention to the ways in which language and the ability to mobilize people through the seductive ideas of words, what that make happen, and what would be possible in a world where you didn't read everything, you weren't kind of daily bombarded with ways to limit your empathy through the television and through what you heard on the news and through what you read and all of that, where it was just possible to actually encounter use your own sensory compass to encounter pain and react to it, and for that to matter. And given that we don't live in that world, I think this is a constant process of trying and failing. And that's where literature comes in, because for me personally, but also more generally, I think the idea of reading and writing and kind of words and continually trying to speak of silences through words is also it's a paradoxical endeavor, and as I said at the start, so is life. As for postmodern, I wouldn't give it too much mind. I don't think that words like I would need like a whole other talk to say what I understand by postmodern and what you understand by postmodern and whether they're the same thing or not. But insofar as that means a kind of the whole point about, Leothard's point about incredulity towards meta-narratives, insofar as that means an incredulity towards an easy meta-narrative that can be, who's the universal? The universal is this kind of, this white male universal European imperialist figure of history who knows everything, who does everything, and whose voice is the voice that we have to go to. Yes, of course, that narrative we have to be incredulous towards, that meta-narrative, that there is the sign of a man through which history can be conducted. But that doesn't mean that we have to be incredulous towards to the very idea that there is something which is in common that we all share as human beings, as as members of the same species that are inhabiting this planet. So I think that it isn't to say that there isn't that a story that only makes sense doesn't mean that there aren't 1,000 stories that are simultaneously making sense, and we have to keep finding the ways to connect them. And the context is what determines how something would be connected, the same kind of thing. It's not as if, so look at something like gender or the question of women. It can be used for completely regressive ways, such as when doing these things and saying, well, we'll take away your rights, but we're doing it because we're liberating the women. No, you're not, because those women are also Kashmiris. So the context matters within these things. So the context matters. We have to be incredulous towards simplistic solidarities, towards simplistic signs under which history has been conducted. But that doesn't mean that we have to be incredulous to the possibility that it can ever, that nothing can ever matter, because if not, then we might as well just cultivate the garden.
Wonderful. I think we should pause here. There's another webinar in 10 minutes time. So I'll pass over to Phil for a final vote of thanks. And just to Nitasha, that I do hope that you have helped us to think about hope for beautiful Mauj Kashmir, the mother Kashmir, right? And I do hope that there is hope for Azaadi as we want it, and for freedom, and not just for Kashmiris, but all of us to think through Kashmir about what this really means. So I'll pass over to Phil now.
Thank you, Meena, and thank you, Natasha. I just want to quickly finish by just picking up. Thank you. Yeah, picking up on a couple of points that I want to take away from today, and it's been absolutely fascinating. I had the pleasure of first visiting Kashmir back in the early 80s, and I was staying on a houseboat, and the owner of the houseboat said, I was just talking about the absolute beauty that you've talked about of Kashmir with him. And he said, well, when you get married, you must come here on your honeymoon. And I sort of shook his hand on that. And I didn't actually go back for my honeymoon, but I went back to Kashmir with my wife. And very sadly, it was then a troubled place. And very sadly, we were going into Kashmir, literally going in on the day a plane dropped out of the sky, and you know the story, and the place erupted. And we had some very difficult times on a houseboat, listening to gunfire all night long. And then, in fact, I got hurt while I was there. So for me, what you said is a real, brought back some real memories for me of some difficult times, but also some absolutely wonderful times. And being white and British, I feel an incredible sense of guilt in a funny sort of way about what's happened to Kashmir, because historically what you've outlined is absolutely correct. But I just want to say a huge thanks for enlightening us in the way that you have done to all that you've said, because I found it absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure everybody attending has done. But I just want to come back to your word of hope. I hope things will get better. I sincerely do, because if you haven't been to Kashmir and you ever get the chance to go to Kashmir, it is the most beautiful place on earth. And I can say that having been to 50 odd different countries around the globe, very fortunately, but it is really, really beautiful as a place. And that sheer beauty brings me to want to go back again and again, and I want to go back. So I want to take your hope and hopes of reconciliation very, very seriously, and hope that things can be reconciled in the future. So thank you both really for an absolutely fascinating hour. It's gone very quickly, far too quickly. We could stay and talk a lot longer. But I wanted to say thanks to a couple of other people, please. I want to say thanks to Hope McGoldrick for all the IT support, and thanks for getting me back in, because you may have noticed I crashed out, unfortunately, so I missed a little bit. But thanks also to Verena for setting up this series of fab seminars that we're having. Just to quickly draw everyone's attention to the series, there is a series of seminars. They're all available. The next one is Lost in Translation, a review of efforts, achievements, and missteps in the use of history in international business studies. And that's on Tuesday, the 20th of April, 4 till 5, similar sort of times. And the speakers at that are you, Son Godwin, and Edward Nicholson. So I hope to see many of you there, and many of you to many of the other of the series that we're having in the future. But thanks to all our attendees. I hope you've found it as interesting as I have. But thank you again, Natasha, and thank you, Meena, for an absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.